The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
But we could say that before this war, the pandemic has also made revolutionary changes, and one of them definitely is more demand on digital economy and of the digitalization of the economy. This in its turn made tax professionals worldwide wonder whether the tax system operating today is ready for such challenges. We will learn more from our next interview. Today we will be speaking about digital economy and some tax approaches towards it. So let's start defining what is digital economy and why it has become such a big issue, especially after the pandemic.
Okay, yeah, good question. From a tax point of view, the digital economy is important because it's transforming the way in which we think about tax. And that is because the current tax rules, which were made in the 1920s, assumes that businesses are bricks and mortar. And now in the 21st century, it's obvious that businesses operate across borders without physical presence. And that means you have to rethink the way in which you tax companies in particular, because they don't have that physical presence. So it's important that we recognize a distinction between digital companies and the digital economy. And the new international tax rules made at the OECD are tackling the problem of the taxing the digitalization of the economy, not the taxation of digital companies, although some of those companies are very much a topic for discussion.
What is the difference there precisely? Because these companies are part of the digital economy, right? Or because of them, the digitalization of the economy happens, right?
The economy is digitalizing and is being used by all businesses. So even companies that say export handbags or furniture or cars, they're using digital technology in the way in which they operate sales, the way in which they operate distribution, the way in which they employ people. And that has changed fundamentally as a consequence of globalization. Now, the big digital platforms and companies, they are an extreme example of how digitalization is impacting the global economy, but it impacts on most companies. So the international tax rules that have been forged at the OECD in the last year tackle the entire problem, not just the problem of targeting one or two digital companies or digital platforms.
Should Georgia be part of it? Because Georgia is still a developing country, right? I mean, it's in transition. It's not particularly OECD country. Should these rules apply to Georgia as well?
Well, Georgia has joined an international coalition of countries in what we call the Inclusive Framework on BEPS, and that BEPS stands for Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, and that is the committee system which gives a voice to all of those countries. They operate on an equal footing to solve the international tax problems of avoidance in particular. Now, what we anticipate is that the rules that were made last year, which are twofold, which maybe we'll come on to in a second, we anticipate that Georgia would benefit because of the reallocation of taxing rights, which we'll come on to, and that's what we call our Pillar 1, and our Pillar 2, which is the introduction of a global minimum tax, which will stop profit shifting around the world and will eradicate tax havens, giving more revenue globally. So although, as you say, Georgia is a relatively small economy, it will benefit from these new tax rules in revenue terms. And over the coming months, we're working with the government to try and pin down exactly the increase in revenues that could be anticipated in Georgia.
Can we bring some specific example how that will work in Georgia's case, and what could be some of the challenges that Georgian companies might be facing during this process?
The first pillar is designed to ensure a fairer distribution of profits and a reallocation of taxing rights. So what we will do is take approximately the top 100 most profitable companies and reallocate those profits according to market principles. So where a market like Georgia consumes products, or people in Georgia use services, they will benefit on the basis that they are a market. And currently there is no other way of properly taxing those companies that don't necessarily have a physical presence in Georgia. So a proportion of that money, of the new allocation of taxing rights, a proportion of that would fall to Georgia by virtue of the fact that Georgia is a market jurisdiction, and the Georgian consumers are buying and consuming products supplied from elsewhere. So what we anticipate is that $125 billion of profit are expected to be reallocated globally, a percentage of which, we don't quite know how much, would be allocated to Georgia. So Georgia would definitely benefit. Now, what we hope is that over time, Georgian businesses would see the benefit of what is a relatively simplified approach to profit allocation. Now, it will take some time to bed down, but this formulaic approach is actually overall a simplification on what exists today. Mm-hmm. So the second pillar, which is the introduction of a global minimum tax, we anticipate that would see countries collect around 150 billion in new revenues, again, some of which would fall to Georgia, because the global minimum tax will put an end to significant profit shifting between jurisdictions. So Georgia would be able to keep more of the revenues that is due to the Georgian Revenue Service.
But there is always two sides to the medal, right? What is the second side? I mean, what is the challenges side? I mean, how would that affect, for example, interest of like big companies to be present in Georgia, which is a relatively small market, when the same tax rules apply to Georgia as well?
Well, the same tax rules will apply globally, so we don't anticipate that one jurisdiction would become more attractive than another. So we anticipate that over time, investors would see the international tax system through these new rules implemented globally as stabilizing the international tax system. And what, as you know, what companies say they want most from a tax system is predictability. And there are implementation challenges ahead, and we will be supporting the Georgian government every step of the way to implement both pillars. But what we do see over time is that there will be tax certainty, because the rules will apply globally, and so that one company operating in Georgia would see the same treatment as where they operate elsewhere. So yes, there are implementation challenges ahead, partly because these rules have not been revisited for over 100 years. So we're playing catch up, and it would be foolish to say that these rules are simple but there are aspects of them that would lead to simplified approaches which would benefit business too. So, for example, we're looking at part of Pillar 1 is looking at new fixed returns on certain distribution functions on our so-called Amount B, for those of you who want to look it up under Pillar 1. I won't go into the complexity. But we hope that that will provide a more predictable and a simplified method of for both business and governments in taxing large companies.
Are there like Georgian companies who are doing the same type of like digitalized business abroad that will be taxed because of these complex global rules? Have you done that assessment as well?
We haven't looked at the assessment of Georgian companies, and that's primarily the responsibility of the government here to go through how they think each company would be treated by the new rules. But again, you've got to distinguish between all companies that are taking advantage of digital technology and digital platforms. So I don't anticipate, for example, if there are small digital platforms that are operating domestically in Tbilisi, say, I don't anticipate that they would be in any way punished by the new international tax rules. No, that's not my understanding for the moment.
Where are these negotiations or consultations right now with the Georgian government, and what are some of the recommendations that you have for them to consider? Globally,
we reached a historic political deal in October of last year, and that saw over 135 countries signing up to the principles of Pillar 1 and 2. Now, that's not the end of the story, because
including Georgia.
Including Georgia. The devil is in the detail, and on Pillar 1, the implementation of Pillar 1 would primarily come into force through a multilateral convention. And there are something like 12 big building blocks which are all being negotiated separately that would flow into the multilateral convention. And Georgia is participating in all those. So we have a political deal, and now to make the deal come into force, the rule-making process continues. On Pillar 2, we've made rapid progress on introducing a series of rules to make that come into force. And it's interesting to note that around the world that there are jurisdictions already moving towards the minimum rate for those that are below it, in anticipation of the world changing to a new global minimum tax. So implementation has not yet hit Georgia, but Georgian officials are very much part of the negotiations to fine-tune the rules and to make them come into force, and we anticipate by the end of this year that big progress will be made and implementation will have started by the end of this year.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.